There's a certain kind of curiosity that most people learn to suppress as they grow older. It's the quiet urge to ask uncomfortable questions, to look beneath polished narratives, to notice the gaps between what is said and what is actually true. That curiosity doesn't disappear, it just gets buried under routines, responsibilities, and the subtle pressure to conform. But every now and then, something stirs it awake again. A thought, a contradiction, a feeling that something important is being kept just out of reach. What begins to unfold is not a collection of shocking secrets, but a shift in how you see the world itself. The idea at the center is simple, almost unsettling in its simplicity. Knowledge is not just discovered, it is filtered, shaped, and sometimes deliberately hidden. Not always through dramatic conspiracies, but often through quiet systems that decide what is worth teaching, what is worth remembering, and what is better left ignored. Think about how most people learn. From an early age, information is presented in structured ways. History is taught as a sequence of accepted events. Science is framed as a steady progression of breakthroughs. Social norms are introduced as natural and unquestionable. There's comfort in this structure, but there's also a cost. Because when knowledge is pre-organized, it often leaves no room for the deeper questions, the ones that don't have clean answers. What starts to become clear is that knowledge itself has layers. There is the surface layer, which is widely accepted and easily accessible. This is what fills textbooks, news cycles, and everyday conversations. Then there are deeper layers, ideas that challenge existing systems, perspectives that don't fit neatly into dominant narratives, and insights that require effort, discomfort, or even risk to explore. The interesting part is not just that these deeper layers exist, but how they are kept out of reach. Sometimes it's through distraction. In a world overflowing with information, attention becomes fragmented. People consume more content than ever before, yet often engage with it less deeply. This creates an illusion of awareness while quietly preventing true understanding. Other times, the filtering happens through authority. When certain institutions or voices are seen as the ultimate source of truth, questioning them can feel unnecessary or even wrong. Over time, this builds a kind of intellectual dependency, where people stop trusting their own ability to analyze and interpret. But the most subtle form of control comes from within. It's the internal hesitation to explore ideas that feel too complex, too controversial, or too far outside the norm. It's easier to stay within familiar boundaries than to risk being uncertain or misunderstood. And so, without any external force, curiosity begins to shrink. As this realization settles in, something shifts. The focus moves away from searching for hidden facts and toward understanding how perception itself is shaped. Because once you see that knowledge is filtered, you start to notice patterns. You notice which ideas are repeated and reinforced, and which ones quietly fade away. You notice how certain questions are encouraged, while others are avoided altogether. This doesn't mean everything is hidden or manipulated. It's more nuanced than that. It means that knowledge is influenced by priorities, economic, social, cultural. And those priorities are not always aligned with truth or understanding. They are often aligned with stability, control, or convenience. And this is where things become more personal. Because the question is no longer about what is hidden from you, but what you might be overlooking yourself. What assumptions have you accepted without examining them? What ideas have you dismissed too quickly? What possibilities have you never even considered? There's a quiet power in asking these questions. Not in a dramatic or rebellious way, but in a calm, steady willingness to look deeper. It's not about rejecting everything you've learned. It's about holding it more lightly, being open to the idea that there is always more beneath the surface. At first, this can feel disorienting. Certainty starts to loosen and familiar frameworks begin to shift. But alongside that uncertainty comes a different kind of clarity, the kind that doesn't rely on fixed answers, but on a deeper awareness of how things connect. And as that awareness grows, a new kind of curiosity begins to take shape. It's no longer driven by the need for quick answers, but by the desire to understand complexity. It becomes less about collecting information and more about seeing patterns, relationships, and underlying structures. What makes this just when you start to feel like you're beginning to understand the nature of hidden knowledge, another layer reveals itself, one that raises an even deeper question. If information can be filtered and controlled from the outside, what happens when the limits are built into the way we think itself? There's a subtle moment when the search for hidden knowledge turns inward, and it changes everything. Up until now, it may have seemed like the challenge was external, systems, institutions, narratives shaping what you see. But a deeper realization begins to emerge: the greatest filter is not outside of you. It's the way your own mind has been trained to interpret the world. From the earliest stages of life, the human brain learns by building patterns. It simplifies reality into categories, labels, and associations. This is necessary. It helps you function, make decisions, and avoid being overwhelmed. But over time, these mental shortcuts become so automatic that they stop being tools and start becoming limits. You don't just see reality as it is. You see it through layers of conditioning. Language shapes perception. Culture defines what feels normal. Past experiences determine what feels possible or impossible. And once these frameworks are in place, the mind begins to defend them, often without you even realizing it. This is where things become more complex than simple ideas of hidden information. Because even if every piece of knowledge were freely available, it wouldn't necessarily mean you could see or understand it clearly. The mind itself resists anything that challenges its existing structure. It prefers consistency over truth, familiarity over disruption. You can notice this in small ways. When you encounter an idea that contradicts what you've always believed, there's often an immediate reaction, not of curiosity, but of discomfort. The mind looks for reasons to dismiss it, to explain it away, to bring things back to a stable, known state. This happens so quickly that it feels like common sense, but it's actually a form of self-protection. And this is one of the most powerful forms of limitation, because it doesn't feel like a limitation at all. It feels like clarity, like certainty, like being right. But in reality, it quietly narrows the range of what you're willing to consider. As this becomes clearer, the idea of banned knowledge starts to shift in meaning. It's no longer just about information being hidden by external forces. It's also about the ideas that never fully reach your awareness because they are filtered out before they can take shape. There are entire perspectives, ways of thinking, and possibilities that remain just outside your mental boundaries, not because they are forbidden in any official sense, but because they don't fit within the structure you've built over time. This realization can feel unsettling, because it suggests that the search for deeper understanding is not just about uncovering new information. It's about unlearning, questioning, and sometimes dismantling parts of your own thinking. But there's also something quietly freeing about it. Because if the limits are internal, they are also flexible. They can be expanded, reshaped, and refined. Not instantly, and not without effort, but gradually, through awareness. One of the first shifts that begins to happen is a change in how you relate to certainty. Instead of clinging to fixed conclusions, you start to hold ideas more lightly. You become more comfortable with not knowing, with exploring without needing immediate answers. And in that space, something interesting happens. Your perception becomes more open, more fluid. You begin to notice things you might have overlooked before. Connections that didn't seem obvious. Questions that didn't seem important. The world starts to feel less like a set of fixed truths and more like a dynamic system of relationships and patterns. And with that shift comes a different kind of intelligence. Not just the ability to store information, but the ability to navigate complexity, to see beyond surface appearances, to recognize that multiple perspectives can exist at the same time, even if they seem contradictory. This doesn't mean abandoning logic or critical thinking. In fact, it requires more of it, but in a deeper, more flexible way. It's about learning to question not just what you see, but how you see it, to recognize the assumptions behind your conclusions, to understand that every perspective, including your own, has its limits. As this awareness deepens, another layer begins to reveal itself, one that is less about knowledge and more about influence. Because if perception can be shaped, and if thinking can be guided in subtle ways, then the question becomes, who is hidden? It's about understanding how influence operates, not just through information, but through attention, emotion, and belief. And just as you begin to see how these forces interact with the mind, another question quietly emerges, one that shifts the focus once again. If your perception can be shaped so deeply, is it possible that even your sense of choice and freedom is not as independent as it seems? There's a quiet tension that begins to build once you start questioning your own thinking. It's no longer just about what you know or don't know, it's about how much of your life is truly directed by you. At first, the idea feels abstract, almost philosophical. But the more you sit with it, the more it starts to touch everyday decisions, habits, and even desires. You might begin by noticing how choices are rarely made in isolation. Every decision exists within a framework, shaped by past experiences, social expectations, available information, and subtle cues in your environment. Even something as simple as what you want can be influenced by things you never consciously agreed to. Preferences feel personal, but they are often constructed. The kind of success you chase, the lifestyle you imagine, even the fears that hold you back, these are not created in a vacuum. They are influenced by stories you've absorbed over time. Stories about what matters, what is valuable, what is possible, and what is out of reach. And once you start seeing this, a deeper question forms. If your desires can be shaped, and your thinking can be guided, then where exactly does your freedom begin? This is where the idea of influence becomes more precise. It's not about control in an obvious or forceful sense. It's about subtle direction. The kind that doesn't feel like pressure, but like a natural pull. The kind that makes certain paths feel obvious and others almost invisible. You can see this in how attention is managed. In a world filled with constant input, what you focus on becomes incredibly important. But attention is not always self-directed. It's guided by algorithms, media cycles, social trends, and emotional triggers. Over time, this creates patterns, loops of information and reinforcement that shape how you see reality. The more something appears in your field of attention, the more real and important it feels. And the less something is visible, the easier it is to ignore, even if it matters deeply. This creates an imbalance, not just in what you know, but in what you consider worth knowing. At the same time, emotional responses play a powerful role. Information that triggers strong reactions, fear, anger, excitement, tends to spread more easily and stay longer in your mind. This isn't accidental. Emotional intensity keeps you engaged, but it can also narrow your perspective. When emotions are heightened, critical thinking often takes a back seat. And so, without realizing it, your understanding of the world can become shaped not just by facts, but by the emotional tone attached to them. This makes it easier for certain narratives to take hold, while others struggle to gain attention. But perhaps the most subtle influence of all is the sense of identity. The way you see yourself, your beliefs, your values, your role in the world, acts like a filter for everything else. You are more likely to accept information that aligns with your identity and reject what challenges it. This creates a kind of feedback loop. Your identity shapes your perception, and your perception reinforces your identity. Over time, this loop becomes stable, even rigid, and anything that threatens it can feel uncomfortable, even threatening, regardless of whether it's true or not. As this becomes clearer, the idea of freedom starts to feel more complex. It's not just about having options. It's about being aware of the forces that shape how you choose between those options. True independence, in this sense, is not something you simply have. It's something you develop. It requires attention, reflection, and a willingness to question not just external systems, but your own internal patterns. This doesn't mean becoming detached or overly skeptical of everything. It means becoming more conscious, more deliberate in how you think, what you consume, and what you accept as true. And there's a quiet shift that happens when you begin to do this. You start to create space between stimulus and response. Instead of reacting automatically, you begin to observe. Instead of immediately agreeing or disagreeing, you pause and consider. In that space, something important emerges, choice that feels more real, more grounded. Not because it is completely free from influence, but because it is made with awareness of that influence. And yet, systems that define the structure of opportunity, access, and power. And this leads to a deeper, more challenging question: if awareness gives you some degree of freedom, how much can an individual truly change when the systems around them remain unchanged? There's a point where personal awareness starts to collide with the reality of the larger world. Up until now, the focus has been on perception, thought patterns, and subtle forms of influence. But as that awareness sharpens, it naturally begins to extend outward. You start to notice that individual thinking doesn't exist in isolation, it operates structures that are already in place. These structures are not always visible in obvious ways. They don't announce themselves. Instead, they show up as systems you move through every day: economic systems, educational paths, social hierarchies, professional environments. They shape what feels possible, what feels realistic, and what feels out of reach long before you consciously question any of it. At first glance, these systems can seem neutral, even necessary. They provide order, coordination, and stability. But the deeper you look, the more you begin to see that they are not evenly designed. They carry built-in advantages and limitations, often favoring certain outcomes while quietly restricting others. This doesn't require any dramatic conspiracy to exist. It's simply the result of how systems evolve. They are built by people, influenced by specific goals, and then maintained over time. Once established, they tend to reinforce themselves. Opportunities flow along familiar paths. Success follows predictable patterns. And anything that falls outside those patterns struggles to gain traction. You can see this in how access works. Access to information, resources, networks, and opportunities is rarely equal. Some people are positioned closer to these advantages from the beginning, while others have to navigate far more obstacles to reach the same point. Over time, this creates a compounding effect where small differences in starting position lead to large differences in outcome. And yet, these differences are often explained in simple terms: effort, talent, discipline. While those factors do matter, they don't tell the whole story. They leave out the structural context that shapes what effort can achieve and how talent is recognized. As this becomes clearer, the idea of hidden knowledge expands again. It's no longer just about what you know or how you think. It's about understanding the frameworks that define the game itself. Because without seeing those frameworks, it's easy to misinterpret outcomes, to blame individuals for systemic patterns, or to accept limitations as natural when they are actually constructed. But there's a delicate balance here. Recognizing these structures can be empowering, but it can also feel overwhelming. Because once you see the constraints, it's tempting to assume that individual action doesn't matter. That everything is predetermined by forces too large to influence. That conclusion, however, is just another kind of limitation, one that replaces unconscious acceptance with conscious resignation. The more nuanced understanding lies somewhere in between. Systems are powerful, but they are not absolute. They shape probabilities, not certainties. They influence direction, but they don't completely eliminate choice. And this is where awareness begins to take on a more practical form. It's not just about seeing the system, but about learning how to move within it more intelligently. To recognize where there is flexibility, where there are gaps, where unconventional paths might exist. Because even the most structured systems have edges. Areas where rules are less rigid, where new ideas can emerge, where shifts can begin. These edges are often uncomfortable and uncertain, which is why most people avoid them. But they are also where change becomes possible. At the same time, there's another layer to consider: how systems are maintained not just through rules and structures, but through belief. A system remains stable as long as enough people accept it, participate in it, and see it as legitimate. The moment that belief starts to shift, the system itself begins to change. This doesn't happen quickly, and it doesn't happen easily, but it does happen. History is filled with moments where long-standing structures were redefined, not just because of external pressure, but because collective perception changed. And that brings the focus back to the individual, but in a different way. Not as someone isolated from the system, but as someone who is part of it, influenced by it, and also capable of influencing it in return, however small that influence may seem at first. There's a quiet, subtle ways to the larger patterns around you. And as this perspective settles in, another question begins to take shape. It's no longer just about understanding systems or navigating them. It's about something deeper and more personal. If you can see the structures, question your thinking, and recognize influence, what does it actually mean to live differently? There comes a moment when understanding is no longer enough. You've questioned your thinking, noticed the patterns of influence, and begun to see the structures shaping the world around you. But awareness, on its own, can feel incomplete. It creates clarity, yes, but it also creates a quiet tension. Because once you see more, you can't fully return to the way you used to move through life. The real shift begins when that awareness starts to translate into how you actually live. At first, this doesn't look dramatic. There's no sudden transformation or complete break from the world. Instead, it shows up in small, deliberate changes. The way you consume information becomes more intentional. You pause before accepting something as true. You become more selective about what you give your attention to, understanding that attention is not just passive, it shapes your internal world. You begin to notice how easily time can be absorbed by noise. Endless streams of content, opinions, and distractions that create the feeling of engagement without leading to real understanding. And so, you start to create space. Not by withdrawing completely, but by choosing depth over volume. This shift alone changes something fundamental. Because when you engage more deeply with fewer things, your thinking becomes sharper, more connected. You're no longer just reacting, you're processing, reflecting, integrating. At the same time, your relationship with certainty continues to evolve. You become less attached to being right and more interested in seeing clearly. This doesn't make you passive or indecisive. It makes you more precise. You begin to recognize the difference between confidence that comes from understanding and confidence that comes from repetition or social reinforcement. And with that precision comes a quieter kind of independence. Not the loud, performative kind that seeks to prove something, but a steady internal alignment. You start to trust your ability to think things through, even when the answers are not immediately obvious. But living differently is not just an internal process. It also affects how you interact with the world around you. Conversations change. You listen more carefully, not just to respond, but to understand how others see things. You notice the assumptions behind their words, just as you've begun to notice your own. This can create moments of distance. Not because you feel superior, but because you see how easily people operate within patterns they haven't questioned. There's a temptation here, to correct, to challenge, to push others toward the same awareness. But over time, you begin to see that awareness cannot be forced. It has to be discovered. And so, your approach softens. Instead of trying to convince, you focus on clarity in your own thinking and communication. You ask better questions. You leave space for others to reflect, rather than trying to lead them to conclusions. There's a kind of patience that develops here, a recognition that understanding unfolds at different paces for different people, and that forcing it often creates resistance rather than insight. Meanwhile, your relationship with systems also begins to shift in a more practical way. Instead of seeing them as something to either fully accept or completely reject, you start to engage with them more strategically. You recognize where they serve a purpose and where they impose unnecessary limits. You learn to operate within them when it's useful, and around them when it's necessary. This requires flexibility, awareness, and sometimes a willingness to take unconventional paths. It's not always comfortable, and it doesn't always lead to immediate results. But it creates a sense of agency that feels more real than simply following predefined routes. At the same time, you become more aware of trade-offs. Every choice, whether it's about career, lifestyle, or beliefs, comes with consequences. There is no perfectly free path, only different sets of constraints. And so, living differently becomes less about escaping limitations and more about choosing them consciously. This is where things become deeply personal. Because the question is no longer about what is hidden or even what is possible. It's about what matters to you once you've seen through some of the illusions that once guided your decisions. What are you optimizing for? Stability? Freedom? Understanding? Importantly, they shape how you define success. Not in terms of external validation, but in terms of alignment between what you see, what you believe, and how you act. This alignment is not perfect. It's something you move toward, not something you fully achieve. There are still moments of doubt, distraction, and inconsistency. But the difference is that you notice them more quickly. You adjust. You refine. And as this way of living becomes more natural, something unexpected begins to emerge. A sense of quiet clarity, not because everything is understood, but because you are no longer blindly navigating. Yet even here, another layer reveals itself. Because once you begin to live with awareness and intention, a new question starts to take shape, one that goes beyond personal clarity and into something deeper. If you can see more clearly and act more consciously, what responsibility comes with that awareness? There's a subtle weight that comes with seeing more clearly. At first, awareness feels like freedom, a release from confusion, from automatic thinking, from unconscious patterns. But over time, it begins to carry something else with it. A sense of responsibility that isn't imposed from the outside, but emerges naturally from within. Because once you start to understand how perception is shaped, how influence operates, and how systems guide behavior, it becomes harder to move through the world carelessly. You begin to notice the impact of small actions. The way words can reinforce or challenge someone's thinking. The way silence can either create space or allow confusion to continue. The way participation, no matter how ordinary, contributes to larger patterns. This awareness doesn't demand perfection. It doesn't expect you to constantly analyze every decision or carry the weight of the world on your shoulders. But it does introduce a quiet question into everyday life: am I acting in alignment with what I now understand? Sometimes, the answer is simple. You choose to step back from conversations or environments that are driven purely by noise or manipulation. You become more mindful of what you support, what you share, and what you give your energy to. These choices may seem small, but they begin to shape your immediate environment in noticeable ways. Other times, the answer is less clear. There are situations where the right path isn't obvious, where different values pull in different directions. Being aware doesn't eliminate complexity, it often reveals more of it. And in those moments, responsibility is less about having the perfect answer and more about staying conscious within the uncertainty. You start to recognize that influence is not something reserved for large platforms or positions of power. It exists in everyday interactions. In how you frame ideas, how you respond to disagreement, how you model thinking through your actions. Influence, in this sense, is not about control, it's about contribution. And this realization can shift how you see your role in the world. Not as someone trying to change everything at once, but as someone who affects the immediate circles around them in subtle but meaningful ways. There's also a deeper layer to this responsibility: how you relate to truth itself. Earlier, the focus was on questioning, on seeing beyond surface-level narratives. But as you move further, you begin to see that questioning alone is not enough. It can easily turn into endless skepticism, where nothing feels solid and everything is uncertain. So the challenge becomes more refined. It's not just about questioning what is presented, but about building a more grounded way of understanding. One that is open, but not unstable. Critical, but not cynical. Flexible, but not directionless. This requires a kind of discipline. Not imposed, but chosen. A willingness to think things through carefully, to seek multiple perspectives, to sit with complexity rather than rushing toward simple conclusions. It's slower, and sometimes less satisfying in the short term, but it leads to a deeper kind of clarity. At the same time, there's an emotional dimension to all of this that often goes unspoken. Seeing more clearly can create distance from old beliefs, from certain conversations, even from parts of your previous identity. There can be moments of isolation where it feels like you're standing slightly outside of the patterns that once felt natural. But that distance is not necessarily a loss. It's also space. Space to rebuild your perspective more consciously. Space to form connections that are based on shared understanding rather than automatic alignment. And gradually, that space begins to fill, not with certainty, but with a steadier sense of direction. You may not have all the answers, but a kind of anchor. Not something rigid, but something reliable. It allows you to move through complexity without feeling completely lost in it. And yet, even as this sense of responsibility and clarity develops, one final layer begins to emerge. It's quieter than the others, but in some ways, it's the most profound. Because after everything, after questioning knowledge, examining thought patterns, understanding influence, navigating systems, and choosing how to live, the question that remains is surprisingly simple: what do you do with all of this, not just as an individual navigating the world, but as a human being trying to find meaning within it? In the end, everything begins to return to a quieter, more personal place. After all the questioning, the awareness, the layers of influence and structure, there's a realization that none of it truly matters unless it connects to how you experience your own life. Not in theory, but in the ordinary, passing moments that make up your days. Because understanding, on its own, can become endless. There is always another layer to uncover, another perspective to consider, another system to analyze. If you're not careful, the search itself can turn into a kind of loop, one that keeps you thinking, but never quite allows you to arrive anywhere. So something begins to shift. The focus moves away from trying to see everything, and towards seeing what actually matters. This doesn't mean abandoning awareness or going back to unconscious patterns. It means integrating what you've learned into a way of living that feels grounded and real. A way of thinking that supports clarity but doesn't consume you. A way of engaging with the world that is conscious but not heavy. You begin to understand that meaning is not something hidden in distant knowledge or complex systems. It's something that takes shape through how you choose to live, moment by moment. Through what you pay attention to. Through what you value. Through how you treat other people, and how you relate to yourself. There's a certain simplicity in this, but it's not naive. It comes from seeing complexity clearly and choosing not to be overwhelmed by it. You realize that while you may not control the larger systems, you do have control over your participation in them. You choose how much of your attention they receive. You choose how deeply you engage, and where you draw boundaries. You choose what kind of thinking you reinforce within yourself. And these choices, repeated over time, begin to shape a life that feels more intentional. There's also a shift in how you relate to uncertainty. Earlier, it may have felt like something to resolve, to replace with clearer answers and stronger conclusions. But now, it starts to feel more natural. Not comfortable in every moment, but acceptable. Even necessary. Because uncertainty is not just a gap in knowledge. It's a space where possibility exists. A space where thinking remains flexible, where perspectives can evolve, where you're not locked into fixed conclusions that may no longer serve you. This doesn't mean drifting without direction. It means holding direction without rigidity, knowing what matters to you, while remaining open to refining it as you learn and experience more. And perhaps most importantly, there's a change in how you see the idea of hidden knowledge itself. At the beginning, it may have felt like something external, something to uncover, to access, to understand. But now, it becomes clear that the most important insights were never completely hidden. They were simply obscured by noise, by assumption, by unexamined patterns of thinking. What you've really done is not uncover a secret world, but clear a path through your own perception. You've learned to see with more depth, more awareness, more intention. And that changes everything, even if nothing around you appears to change at all. The world is still complex. Systems still exist. Influence is still present. But your relationship to all of it is different. You're no longer moving entirely on autopilot. You're not reacting without noticing. You're not accepting everything at face value. There's a quiet steadiness in that. Not because you figured everything out, but because you developed a way of navigating without needing to. And from that place, something else becomes possible, a kind of balance. A balance between awareness and action. Between questioning and acceptance. Between thinking deeply and living simply. You don't need to chase every hidden layer. You don't need to resolve every uncertainty. You don't need to stand outside the world to understand it. You can be within it, fully engaged, while still seeing clearly. And maybe that's the most grounded form. Valuable knowledge is not the kind that makes you feel like you've discovered something others haven't. It's the kind that changes how you see, how you think, and ultimately, how you live.